Today, I want to talk about the Christian spiritual experience, as it is such a linchpin for justifying the faith, especially when the text starts to fail, when the logic starts to fail, when the correct history is showing up, the correct science is showing up, and it's getting harder and harder to prove your particular faith. You can just fall back to spiritual experience. Well, I felt. There's many different kinds of spiritual experiences, but one that so many humans have felt and can relate to is that sense of being so small amidst the universe, of recognizing that there's something larger than yourself going on in the world. Now, as someone who is deconverted, I see this for what it is. I can see the psychology behind it. I can see the evolutionary benefit behind it. It's natural. It's part of what it is to be human. But I wanted to share a story today that hopefully can help relate to those of you still doubting or deconstructing that we've all gone through this, that I'm not just speaking from some headspace. I know what it's like to be a fervent believer. I believed for 30 years. I know what it's like to orient your entire life around your belief. I know what it's like to fully be convinced that this God is real, that heaven awaits, that you're a sinner in need of salvation, and that Jesus Christ is the way. And I know what it's like to know all of that with your whole heart, with the true essence of feeling of spirit and soul. Not just from what I had read in the Bible or what had been said to me at church, but because I was living it, because I was having these real spiritual experiences for myself, or so I thought. And so again, today, I want to tell you the story of one of the most powerful spiritual experiences that I had and how I had to work through that myself in my own deconstruction. And I'm going to share with you what I found, again, scientifically, psychologically speaking, through neuroscience that helped me understand what was actually going on so that I didn't continue to falsely attribute the natural awe that the human is capable of with the particular divine explanation that was my framework culturally speaking. For me, that experience was solo hiking. I was 28 years old, we were expecting our first child, and I got this craving inside of me, a longing to shore up my relationship with God the Father before becoming a father myself. A seeking out to be even closer, to hear even more clearly from His Spirit. What did He want from me? I was growing my family now. What was my responsibility? What would I teach my son? How would I lead my wife? Now, none of this is the story of someone who didn't believe and start seeking after God. I always believed, and I thought I had a really good relationship, personally speaking, with Jesus Christ. I believed I heard from the Holy Spirit that had made me a new creation, that dwelled inside of me. I prayed every single day, and I believed that I heard back. And I believed I was being pulled to go have this larger experience, or at least to seek after it, as we are told to seek after our God, to draw near to Him. And where did I know that God was from reading the Bible? Even if just symbolically, God was up. And though I lived nowhere near mountains, I felt this calling to do what so many of my biblical heroes had done, which was to climb to a high place in seeking out this God more deeply. Now, I can already hear some Christians saying, see, if you really had a relationship with God, you wouldn't have felt the need to go do this big act and go after Him. And that's fine. You can have your opinions on it, but I know where my sincerity was. And those kinds of after-the-fact excuses, I think, fall really lame again when compared to what we read about in the Bible. So I want to share with you some of my inspiration in wanting to undertake this new hobby, to go into the wilderness by myself, to go and climb high places, to meet with God, to rely on God, to be still before my Maker, and to open myself up to hearing more clearly, to putting in the effort and the work to show not that only God can speak at high places, but that I was willing to go to Him. Symbolically, it was important to me, and biblically, I thought there was plenty of good reason. The mountains functioned for so much throughout the scriptures. People went to the mountain for revelation, like Moses at Sinai. Or think about Elijah, who hears the still small voice, the whisper of God on Horeb. Did Jesus not climb the mount before his transfiguration? Mountains also served as an actual meeting place. I think about the Temple Mount. I think about even the Ark resting on Mount Ararat, or Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah. Mountains were where teaching and prayer happened, like the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus, or the multiple times that we see that Jesus went up to the mountains to pray. The Great Commission is given on a mountain in Galilee. So according to the Bible, these are real physical events that actually transpired, and there's so many more. But then, of course, also biblically, we get the symbolism of the mountains, their closeness in proximity to heaven, and heaven being where God is. They represented a separation from the world. It was distancing from the world and going ever nearer your Maker. They were places where testing of faith happened, where spiritual elevation happened. And one of my favorite verses, one of my favorite songs, Psalm 121, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? It comes from the Lord, who I recognized is the Creator, is my Maker, is who I owe allegiance to and loyalty to and love to and devotion to, who I would seek out my guidance and counsel from. And so I made a plan. I explained it to my wife. I took time off work. For some of you, it's not a big deal. For someone like me, having very little experience in the mountains, let alone backpacking, multiple day backpacking, and doing so solo, it felt like an undertaking, and that felt good. I was working physically toward getting closer to my God. And so I spent a few months preparing, planning where I would go. I ended up going to Colorado. How did it work? What gear did I need? Did I need to get permits? The whole thing. And it was a very beautiful start to a hobby that I still do. In fact, I was gone and you didn't get a video on Thursday and you got repeat videos on Tuesday and Sunday last week because, again, I was in the mountains, this time in Idaho. And I still got that same feeling of awe, but I didn't misattribute it. And now I can enjoy it for what it is, and I can still benefit from it psychologically. And we'll talk about all of that here at the end. But back to the story here. It's nothing I thought couldn't happen in my room on my knees praying by myself. It wasn't magic to me. It was meaningful to me. And so the whole process of preparing for it became meaningful to me. It all felt like one big devotion, one big Bible study or fast or any other way that I had poured into becoming closer with God in the past. I brought a Bible with me to read when I would be up there. I brought a journal so I could capture whatever God might put on my spirit. And I went way into the backcountry, something I was not prepared for physically or really even emotionally. To spend that much time by myself, it was the first time in my life where I had just been quiet for 5 days. I saw maybe 2 or 3 other people the entire time and spoke to no one. I didn't speak at all except out loud to my God. I remember the first night I was 8 miles in from this very remote trailhead on the northwest side of the Rockies. I set up my tent, I made myself some dinner, and as the sun began to set, I climbed the highest ridge I could find. I got on my knees, looked up to the sky, and prayed and worshiped, and it was beautiful. Every verse that I had memorized about the other men of God seeking after God in the high places was rushing past my mind, and I felt connected. I felt what I attributed as the presence of the Holy Spirit. I communed with God in a way that I had 1,000,000 times before through prayer, but it felt heightened. Of course it did. How could it not? There were so many factors playing into this moment and the moments that I would have over the next few days, and then the moments that I would feel over the next few years on these hikes as I started to do many of these trips per year. Sometimes by myself, sometimes with my wife, sometimes with friends, but always I would take that moment on the first night and go off to a high place and kneel and speak to God. I thought my prayers were earnest. They weren't for blessing. They weren't for riches. They weren't for protection. They were for knowledge and wisdom and closeness and for faith. It's why I always laugh when I am accused of being a not real Christian, one that never truly sought or wasn't sincere. Tell that to the weeping Brandon on the mountain by himself with his Bible and his God, praying only for discernment, only for revelation, only for the faith of Abraham and Noah and Moses. And in a Christian framework, which was my framework, all of this made sense. All of it is what one would expect. But I always had a critical mind, and I remember even then fighting thoughts of, I wonder if this pilgrimage, for lack of a better term, had been myself as a Muslim, and I was calling God by another name and reading surahs from the Quran instead of verses from my Bible. Would I have had the same experience? But that's just the devil speaking. They're not having real experiences because they're worshiping a false God. They're believing a false doctrine. I had the truth. My God was real, and therefore my experience was testimony of that reality. And so I don't think I'll go on with the details of that trip, all of the special moments I had relying on God. And again, this happened for years. And then the mountains became a place during my deconstruction of desperation. There were a handful of trips that were between that place of that initial moment I've talked about, my last beautiful thought about God, as I read my young son a story about Jesus' love, and the time that came after, where I could no longer see it, where I could no longer believe it. And so again, a few of those trips were me triple checking myself. Was I wrong? Was I deceived? Was I being handed over to my own sin? And I would go to the mountains and get on my knees on a high place and look up to God and beg that after 30 years, he would not let me fall away, that he wanted all to be saved, that I wanted to be saved, that I wanted to believe, but here were the issues. And again, no one can take away what I know to be the sincerity of those moments. So, take all of that, move forward in time. I now no longer believe. I haven't believed for years. And as you've seen on the channel, I've shown all of the other issues I had with this God and an internal critique of his character bumped up against the claims of his triomny properties, the issues with the text itself and the contradictions and the dating and the authorship, and all of the other reasons that my deconstruction and eventual deconversion happened. But how did I account for 30 years of experiencing this God? I think this is something many of us go through during our deconstruction, when we can start to feel like, yeah, from a headspace, God doesn't make sense, but from a heart space, it's the most real thing that there is. And shouldn't that count for something? Shouldn't that, in fact, matter more? Isn't that what faith is? And it's one of the most common questions that I get, and this video is a long-winded way of trying to answer by way of showing you that I too have been through it, and that there are answers that many of us were deprived of in Christian education, from understanding the reality of our nature, of our evolution, of our brain chemistry, of our psychology, that does absolutely provide not only an answer, but a much more reliable, consistent, and validating answer than God did it. Because I've covered that a few times recently too, whether it was on the Big John Steele video with his claims about, well, everyone's having experiences of God, therefore God is true, to the video I did about where you're born determines what you believe, where again, we looked at everybody's ability to believe what is convenient to their time and place. And not just believe it, but have experiences that seemingly back that up, which is our first cognitive effect we need to talk about. So now we're going to move into this section here where we explain what was actually happening to me, to my brain. And the first one is confirmation bias, the tendency to seek, interpret, and recall information that confirms prior beliefs. Isn't that exactly what I was doing with those verses about God being on high? Seeking, interpreting, and recalling information that aligned with my framework, my beliefs, what I read in the Bible about this God, about his nature, about how he communicated. How did this work for me? Well, I went with what expectation? To sense God, to feel God, to hear from God, to feel close to God. So that first night when I'm kneeling on that ledge, looking out over one of the most beautiful sunsets I had ever seen, did that seem like a gift from God? As that rush of wind came out of seemingly nowhere and raised the hair on the back of my neck, Was that not the Holy Spirit? Did that rush of emotion, the adrenaline of being at the edge, of feeling something new, seeing something new, being alone and quiet and exhausted, did all of these things get interpreted as a divine experience? You betcha. And of course they did. And of course they should have under that framing. The great pattern detecting of the brain, which is our second point here, apophenia, or what Schumer calls patternicity. I did a video on it here if you want to learn more, but our brain loves to find connections to its own detriment, to over-identifying and over-connecting. The natural beauty around me started to look awfully designed. And you don't have to go as far. Some people, this is where that pareidolia will kick in and you see God's face in the cloud or in the piece of toast or whatever. No, it didn't have to be anything that crazy to me, but my brain was primed for an experience to occur if I did X, Y, and Z. And so I did X, Y, and Z. And then what does my brain do? It concludes the pattern. It works with confirmation bias to make that wind meaningful, to make the sound I just heard that I've never heard before, surely not because I'm in a brand new environment for the first time and totally on edge through this kind of experience. No, it must be God. What are the chances that I'm literally seeing the greatest sunset of my life on the first night that I go out to do this trip for God? It couldn't just be that I'd never been in the mountains and seen the sunset over something so beautiful. And looking back, it almost sounds silly and stupid, pedantic to not have recognized these other factors, and I'm sure I was aware of them, but why would I have clung to them, the less special, the less meaningful, the mundane, the ordinary, the natural, when my entire purpose was supernatural, which is the third point here, and I mentioned it already, the priming effect. My prior reading of scripture, the sermons that I had heard, the heroes that I had, the books that I had read, primed me to interpret mountains, and solitude, and beauty, and stillness with God. And now I had those things in spades. And priming works even further than how you interpret something. And that's kind of those first two. Priming can even lead to what you notice. If I'm primed to have this beautiful, tender, divine experience, then you know what I wasn't focused on? All the horse shit on the trail. That didn't fit my priming of what I was going to experience, what was going to happen. My view wasn't about the trash that someone had left at that backcountry spot and how that would later make me so angry as I really become a practitioner of leave no trace. But if my priming had been as a forest ranger in training, I bet I would have noticed that. I bet that would have been significant. I bet the broken bridge on the trail would have been a whole different meaning, maybe reinforcing the necessity of my role and what I'm putting my time towards. But my priming wasn't as a forest ranger, it was as a man seeking after his God, and so those things disappear into the peripheral, and things that map on to my expected experience start to get highlighted. I pull out my map and I see certain terms, names of streams, names of small mounts nearby. Some of them are divine, some of them are biblical. That sticks out. The fact that there's also a peak named after an early French explorer, or the trail is actually named after a close-by county, they don't mean anything. They don't even register because it's not the story my brain is trying to tell. And I know we're being thorough here, but I'm trying to show you how literally when you're in these moments, when you're having these experiences, you become so fully encompassed in all of the meaning, all of what you think are the details, the things that are too coincidental, and all you can see is God, if that's what you were expecting to see. All you can sense is the divine, if that's what you're expecting to sense. Another term for you here is anchoring bias, where first associations act as interpretive anchors. Mountains equaled holy in my worldview. So then that became the lens with which all things were viewed through when in the mountains. Holy. And then there's this really interesting term that I'd like to do its own episode on, which is HADD, H-A-D-D, Hyperactive Agency Detection Device. Evolutionary psychology suggests here that humans evolved to over-detect agents, predators, people, gods. That's how hearing the wind in the trees can feel like presence. And solitude all of a sudden feels inhabited, encroaching on some other realm. So those are just a few examples of the many things that go on in our brain, in our cognition, in our psychology that can allow us to mistranslate the world, to misattribute the experience and feelings that we have. And one of those feelings, again, is awe. And so I want to talk quickly about the psychology of awe. There's a great 2003 research paper on the small self effect, and it connects that awe is that feeling small amidst the universe, but that smallness actually helping us feel connected, something we as humans crave, and thus that's a brilliant happening. When you're a believer, you attribute awe with God's grandeur instead of the non-believers, just good cosmic perspective. E.O. Wilson has this biophilia hypothesis, suggesting that humans are innately drawn to nature because it provides us survival cues long ingrained into us. Trees, water, and mountains, they do physically calm us, not because they're divine, but because of the place they held for our ancestors. And again, you can argue some of this, and there's definitely counterpoints and counter-arguments about the evolutionary purpose of why our resting heart rate gets even lower near large bodies of water, or why if you have someone look at the mountains to produce that small self effect in them, they become more generous in the minutes following than another group looking out over flat land. Did ancient people see the same characteristic bending trait and associate when someone went up to the mountains and came back more ethical and generous, which is what that study shows? That mapped on they had met with God? Maybe. Most of what we know as mythology and religion is just trying to explain the natural before we had the tools and language and know how to do so. And so God's got a lot of credit for natural things that just happen in our brain. So that's kind of the pro-sociality of awe. Then you have an interesting term, DMN, the default mode network, or I should say the suppression of that. Really interesting study. I think I first heard about this with Sam Harris, the fRMI machines, which can read our brains, for lack of a better explanation, show that awe, meditation, psychedelics, all suppress DMN, the default mode network. You know, the part of the brain tied to ego. Oh, so you get a heightened present moment awareness and a sense of oneness. I wonder if that could have produced feelings that I was attributing to the divine. Yeah, if your religious framing, if all of your anchoring and expectation and pattern recognition is going to be based off these biblical ideas, then that sure does make sense. To interpret this as union with God, because these feelings, they don't just happen when I'm sitting around the house doing chores. So this must mean something, and you can't take away my feelings. Yes, you can. Unfortunately, scientifically speaking, you can explain them, which is the same thing as taking them away from the divine meaning that the believer attributes them to. And that's not the goal of this. The goal is when someone already knows better. They see the flaws, they see the holes, they see the harm, and yet they can't quite get themselves to leave, usually based out of both fear tied to and bound up by their spiritual experiences. So allowing someone the correct structure and framing for interpreting correctly or more correctly those experiences as natural and not supernatural, I think is an incredibly worthwhile endeavor. One of my favorite philosophers, William James, a pragmatist who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, talks about this at great length, these mystical type experiences, documenting how solitude plus nature produce ineffability, which, by the way, are universal experiences, not tied to Christians. One of the first things I had to be convinced of was that other religions were actually having experiences on the same level that I was, just under a completely different framing. I, for so long, either thought that they were not, that they could not, or then I attributed it to, oh, it must be the devil then deceiving them. But accepting that they are human like I was, and thus capable of having the very same human experiences I was having, took a lot of ammo out of that gun about Christianity being true because of its unique ability to actually produce divine results. none of them are divine results. They're all natural. They're all being attributed to their God, their framework, their culture. And it's only the specifically monotheistic ones that do the exclusionary claims that one first has to get over. And I had so much more here, and I think we might go through it quickly because I'm realizing this is long and I want it to be chunked down and useful. But there's also, of course, and I keep alluding to it, tons of social and cultural influences at play here too. We could talk about cultural script theory, attribution theory. We could get into sacred geography. All cultures have them. Isn't that interesting? And the social learning and the modeling that was going on. And then, you know what? I didn't prepare all the right terms for this, but as I was speaking earlier, I kind of thought there's probably just a lot of physiology along with the neuroscience and psychology that we're talking about. Like, I was at altitude for the first time in my life, and I had exerted a significant amount of effort hiking 8 miles back up. I think it was close to 3,500 feet of elevation between the trailhead and night 1 at 8 miles. I'm from sea level. That was crazy. So the altitude, the exertion, the endorphins. What about the solitude? That had to have done something. The sensory deprivation that would have gone along with this. The first time that I had not spoken in a day or not spoken to anybody. The declutter of noise in everyday life. There's some very real studies on the impact of nature on stress. Was I finally just at my calmest? Did fear play into any of this at all as the sun is setting on my first time being alone and far away in a new and honestly kind of terrifying environment? Maybe that fear was pushing me closer to feeling like I had someone, something with me. What I see so clearly now is that it's all framing. I was a believer. I had expectations as a believer and a brain that was working to back up what I had already believed. And so I got an experience that believers of other gods and in other religions have also had and mapped onto their God, and that people like myself now who don't believe can still have, but with a completely different framing and understanding. And now it's that of psychology and science and physiology and everything else that we talked about. And by the way, it doesn't take anything away from those experiences. I still love going to the mountains as much as I did then. Knowing how the wiring of my brain is actually making that feeling of awe doesn't reduce that feeling of awe. If anything, it heightens it. Oh my gosh, look at what we're capable of. This is all natural. This is all amazing. And this is one example. This is awe, and specifically awe of nature. But there are a billion ways to have a personal or spiritual experience that maps onto whatever you believe and whatever experience you are having. The example here, hopefully, is just what our brains are capable of and how natural this is and how that's okay. And to help you maybe get a little bit of tools. I mean, there's still so many other things that are happening in our bodies and in our brains that continue to explain this into a much higher and better degree than I just did. All you have to do is be willing to look. Be willing to be open to that possibility that maybe this thing you've clung to as the most clear evidence for your God has always been evidence for all gods and is actually not evidence at all. That's it for today. Thanks so much for being here. We are back on track. I hated being off for a while there, but I'll see you Tuesday with another reaction video. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast and Boris, Grant, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, yes, the Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Criagh, James, Jared, Christy, and Matthew, my Atheist advocates, Equitar, Caleb, Dakota, Dan, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Jugs, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. And to everyone else who gives in any capacity, thank you so much.